Pull up a chair, let the cups clink soft. Little laugh in the corner, world talking on and off. Sip slow truth while the headlines drop. Welcome into Ken's Coffee Shop.
Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to Ken's Coffee Shop on this Sunday, the 8th day of March, 2026. And if you're like me, you will be in a fog for the next week because we turned our clocks ahead an hour last night. And I don't know about you, but I hate that. I think probably everybody in this country agrees that we hate changing our clocks. And it's a very confusing issue because people will say that they are against daylight savings time. And I don't think that's what they're against. I think they're against changing their clocks. But if you're like me, you'd like it to be daylight savings time all the time, because tomorrow I can play golf and not worry about my round ending till like 7:15 when it really gets dark. I hate the winter hours. I lived in England for 3 years. And during the winter, when we were on standard time, it would actually be dark when I'd be in the office, totally dark before 4 o'clock. I also had the benefit of once doing an acquisition in Norway in the middle of June, close to the longest day of the year, when it doesn't even get dark. It gets dusky for a little bit around 3 a.m. And believe me, I would much prefer a day that was longer than one that was shorter. And I know there are people that are on the opposite side to say, oh, but the kids have to stand out at the school bus stop in the dark, and that's no good. Hey, I'm from the 60s and 70s in Scranton. We didn't have school buses. We walked a mile each way in the snow uphill. And so we did that in the dark and in the rain and everything else. But I don't know about you. I'm hoping that finally we will take action to make time standard and not change, hopefully choosing the daylight savings time as the norm. I lived in Indiana for a while, the part of Indiana that didn't change its clocks. And I can tell you that was confusing as heck when you didn't change your clocks, but everybody around you did. And growing or working in South Bend, Indiana, just south of the Michigan border, it was strange because you had to remember what time Michigan was on so you knew what time the Walmart closed. But I just wanted to start with that today. I wanted to start by doing a Surfing the Net segment where I go through some of the stories I've seen Facebook, internet during the week. The first one really, I just read it this morning, and this one really affects me. I am not a fan of the death penalty. Let me start right there. I believe in the death penalty in the cases of terrorism and in the cases where you have a prisoner kill a corrections officer. Because if you don't have the death penalty for that, you got a guy in jail, life in prison. He's got absolutely no reason not to commit murder. But Alabama is scheduled on Thursday to execute a man, and his crime was he was part of a robbery. It was a robbery of a store. His name is Burton, the man who's on death row and scheduled to be executed. Charles Sonny Burton. And since it's Alabama and he's on death row, I don't think I need to tell you that he's African American. He did not kill anyone. He was not in the store when a customer was shot in the back and killed by one of his 5 accomplices. He had left the store. He was outside in the car. He was convicted of murder under something called the felony murder statute, which basically says if you commit a felony and in the process of the commission of that felony, somebody is murdered, then actually if someone's killed, but it doesn't really need to have the elements of murder as long as it's a homicide. And he, of course, fell in that category. He was part of the gang, and during their robbery, somebody was killed. The person who committed the murder was also sentenced to death. He had his sentence changed to life in prison. because of his claims of ineffective representation by counsel during the sentencing phase of his trial. And so you had this strange situation for a while where the guy who actually killed the man is serving life. The guy who was out in the car when the man was killed is still on death row. And the man who actually was the murderer, he died a few years ago while he was serving life. But the execution is scheduled for Thursday. And I have real problems with that. I have problems with the death penalty in general because unless we actually see it happen, there's always questions. I mean, we all know that Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby because millions of us saw it happen live on television on a Sunday morning. I didn't. I was actually in the other room playing with some stuff, but I remember, I think it was my sister saying something. They were watching the TV and mentioning that he'd been shot. I mean, in those cases, yeah, we know who committed the murder, but there are so many instances in this country of false identification of people, false convictions. I mean, we've spent a century analyzing Sacco and Vanzetti and determining they probably weren't guilty. They were basically executed for the crime of being Italian American. You had Bruno Hauptmann, who evidence it continues to evolve to suggest he did not kill the Lindbergh baby. And heck, we've had maybe 150 years now of controversy as to the exact guilt of the Molly Maguires up there in the Cole County. And that, that's one of the problems with the death penalty. So in general, I'm not a big fan. But in this case, where he was not in the store when the man was killed, but he was an accessory, and so he's guilty under the felony murder statute. It just seems like it's not a proper or just result. Now, hopefully the governor will intervene, but again, it's Alabama, and it's an African-American man. So I ask you to keep an eye on that one. If you're the kind of people who pray, maybe pray that the guy gets some justice and gets his sentence commuted to life. And in case you're there, well, we need eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth and all that kind of stuff. The decedent's daughter, who was 9 years old at the time, has petitioned the governor to stop the execution. So even the family of the decedent does not want the execution to go forward. Also in the internet news I was looking at, I mentioned this briefly last week. Democrats in Colorado have introduced legislation to make it the first state in the union to legalize prostitution on a statewide basis. Nevada, prostitution is only allowed in certain counties which have a population under a certain threshold. Of course, illegal prostitution takes place in Las Vegas, Reno, and other places in Nevada, even without the legalization. But Democrats in Colorado have introduced this. It's an aim, of course, to raise money. They're going to tax it. If we can find anything that we can tax, we're going to think about legalizing it. Colorado was one of the first to legalize recreational marijuana. And prostitution is one that many places have legalized. The U.S. is still a bit behind the world when it comes to this. In many countries, it's illegal to solicit, but it's legal to be a prostitute. It's basically, they want to eliminate the idea of somebody bothering people in coming up and offering services, but don't make it a crime or have decriminalized it and make it a small fine. It'll be interesting to see what Colorado does with that, because I am a libertarian, not the libertarian that you hear of these days, which libertarian today tends to mean far right. And I always say that's with a capital L. And there's a Libertarian Party, which isn't libertarian. A libertarian, we're the ones who like hookahs and hookers. Let people smoke what they want. Let them use the drugs that they want as long as they're obtained legally. And hey, state, sell them and make money on them, like we're making all that money by taxing marijuana in states that are doing that, unlike the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where they continue to resist legalizing recreational marijuana. It's legal here in Maryland, and we haven't seen our society fall apart here as a result. And we actually have generated some tax dollars from it. We legalized gambling, a vice that for years was illegal and immoral, and we want nothing to do with it. We've legalized gambling. Now we've gone from gambling being illegal to sporting events being sponsored by gambling organizations. And all of us now, we don't need our bookie anymore. We can just go onto our phone. Growing up, anybody who's watching this from South Scranton might remember a certain pizza joint in Scranton where growing up, the phone would ring 50 times and the owner would write down 50 orders and he'd put one pizza in the oven because he was taking bets on the harness racing in Pocono Downs. So as a libertarian, I actually support the move in Colorado. It's one of those weird things. You know, sex is something that you can give away, but you can't sell. But you can sell it as long as you're not making it a direct quid pro quo. So yeah, sex for dinner and a movie, that's fine. Sex for $200, that's not fine. And I think as we go forward, I think we're going to start seeing a change in the views of things like prostitution. And believe it or not, that actually ties into a much bigger topic, and that is, of course, the one of American exceptionalism and the fact that we do tend to be different than the rest of the world in a lot of things. You look at what we have on television here, and 30 years ago when I was living in England, and actually it's over 30 years now, we had nudity on broadcast television. We hadn't quite come to Channel 4's show Naked Attraction, which is actually a naked form of the dating game, where you don't get to see the face of the person that you are selecting. You only get to see their genitalia and, in the case of the women, their breasts. But you can't imagine that ever having been a broadcast show here in the U.S. And I can remember on Friday nights watching a show from Germany in German, which I didn't understand, called Tutti Frutti, which never really understood what the premise of the show was. But at some stage in every show, the contestants and the ladies, the dancers on the show, would start disrobing for some reason. Our views of sex and body image and all that stuff have always been so much more prudish than the rest of the world. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Colorado. And they started the avalanche, if you will, with the legalization of recreational marijuana, and it has spread to many states since then. It'd be interesting too to see. We saw it with gambling. Once the Supreme Court struck down the ban on sports betting, sports betting became ubiquitous in this country. I think there's only a few states where you can't legally bet on sports yet. I think California is still one of them. But it'll be interesting to see whether we have a similar trend should Colorado go forward with this. Because again, it is a way to balance the budget, and we need all that revenue we can get. All right, I wanted to talk last week and didn't get to it because I have that tendency to do that, about the SAVE Act and voter ID. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the SAVE Act, and you've heard about voter ID, and you've seen all the memes on Facebook and everywhere else. You've seen all of the accusations that it's racist. We saw Jasmine Crockett this week in Texas in a primary claim that it was voter suppression that caused her to lose her party primary, that the Republicans had suppressed votes so she would lose, even though her opponent was expected to win. And two, her opponent probably has a better chance of winning the general election. So if anything, the Republicans would have done an Operation Chaos, if you remember, 2016, was it? Operation Chaos, I think, was 2008. Yeah, that's right. 2008, when Rush Limbaugh was trying to derail Hillary and ended up getting President Obama as a result. The SAVE Act is not going to pass the Senate because the Republicans will not end the filibuster over the SAVE Act. And it's never going to get the 60 votes needed to come to the floor. Both sides are distorting the impact of the SAVE Act. That's absolutely true. The Republicans say, oh, it's nothing. You just need an ID. Everybody has ID. Democrats are saying this is going to disenfranchise millions of women and people, transgender and others, whose birth certificate doesn't match their current name. And yes, a birth certificate is one item that you could use for registration, but it's not necessarily an item that's required. And they try to mess up what you need to register versus what you need to actually go and vote. If you're like me, I voted all my life, even though I've lived in other states. I tended not to register when I lived there. The only place I've ever voted was the state of Pennsylvania. And you'd go in and your identification consisted of signing in the register, and a poll worker would compare the two signatures. I don't think any of them were really trained in identifying signatures. And if they thought the signatures matched, it was fine. If they didn't, you showed a little more identification. That's probably the weakest standard of identification in the world. Most of the rest of the civilized and uncivilized world requires some form of registration. Many countries issue, and I know conservatives hate this idea, but many countries issue national IDs, which go with you all your life, and you use it to prove who you are. I've always thought we could kill two birds with one stone, enact a national healthcare system, give people a healthcare card, and require you to use that as your voter ID. It would get both parties pissed off at me, I'm sure. Is there massive voter fraud in this country? Probably not. Is there some? Probably. We have poll workers that have been known to help voters go into the polling, the actual voting booth and vote. I'm sure there's influence that takes place at home when people are filling out mail-in ballots. Can you use your death certificate as identification to vote? That's the question. I mean, there have been memes suggesting the Democrats don't want to lose the vote of the dead voters because they tend to be a Democratic voting bloc. If you're like me and you're old and you remember the late 1960s in Lackawanna County, when we elected Commissioners Lugar and Pettinato, their ad was fantastic. I forget the guy's name. I'm going to say it was Charlie. And the ad showed a cemetery and said, poor Charlie, he died 20 years ago. But every year on election day, he rises from the grave to come and vote. And it was very effective. And that's been a claim for years about dead people voting. And I'm sure there is some of that really does happen. I want to talk about the hangover we have from 2020. I think that drives a lot of things. The people that erroneously believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. And they believe that because he had a massive lead on election night and then ended up losing. And we saw that in Pennsylvania, statewide, all the races, big leads for the Republican, and then that lead dissipated, and in many cases ended up reversing over the coming days as they counted a record number of mail-in ballots. Now, some people will therefore conclude the mail-in ballots were fraudulent. Other people will go back and just reset a week or two before the election, where we knew that most, or at least, most, means more than half of the mail-in ballots were coming from Democratic voters. Democrats tended to accept the idea of, hey, it's COVID, we're going to drop our mail-in ballot in the mail and be done with it. Republicans were against the mail-in ballots. They showed up at the polling place. On election night, the results we saw were the results from the voting machines, because Pennsylvania didn't start counting ballots until after the polls had closed. So we all knew that the Republicans were going to have a massive advantage in the votes that were done in person, and the Democrats were going to in the ones that were done by mail. And that's exactly how it happened. That's how the election turned out. And there's no indication otherwise. And now we found out that there was some technical irregularity in certifying certain votes in Georgia, but those votes were not invalid. They just weren't certified properly by the bureaucrats that are supposed to certify them. We saw election disputes in 2016. Hillary's people wanted to overturn the election by trying to convince electors not to vote for Trump. We've got people claiming that Harris won in 2024, which is absolutely ridiculous. 1960, we know that Richard Nixon probably won the election, but Joe Kennedy helped to carry Chicago thanks to the mafia, and they carried Texas thanks to Lyndon Johnson. If you're ever interested in a little bit of history, go back and look at 1876 and President Tilden. You've all heard of President Tilden, right? No, you haven't, because he ended up losing that election, even though everybody knows he won, because the Republicans had an alternative slate in Florida, and they were able to create a contest for those votes, take it to the House of Representatives, and then broker a deal. I mean, in that election, we actually selected a president by the Republicans agreeing to cease Reconstruction and the Democrats agreeing to allow Chester Arthur to become president. We sold out the freed slaves for the purpose of winning the presidency. But as I said, we're the only country I'm aware of that does not require some form of picture ID to vote, some form of official ID. So what is the problem with the SAVE Act and voter ID? The problem is that the Republicans who put this forward tend to make it so difficult to get the ID that you are going to end up in a case where people are being disenfranchised because they can't obtain the necessary ID, or there is a cost to obtain it. And then that starts invoking the constitutional amendment against the poll tax. And you can't have poll taxes are no longer allowed. They were used very effectively during Jim Crow to keep black voters from voting and poor people from voting, because you couldn't afford the poll tax and you didn't vote. And why bother paying some money to vote when you know it's not going to change anything? So we have this thing that's going to go on for a while, this argument about voter ID. Hopefully, eventually, somebody will be reasonable and say, hey, let's come up with a voter ID system where the ID is reasonably easy to obtain. Everybody can get one. Hopefully, it's free or close to free. We provide for situations where you've changed your name or even changed your gender. You know, we want Caitlyn Jenner to be able to vote. We've come up with a system to address that and move forward, because while there might not be a lot of cheating, one thing that's important is election integrity. And other than the two Obama victories, we haven't really had elections in a long time where people really felt good about the result or didn't challenge the result. I mean, we know Bush didn't win Florida in 2000 because we know that those people weren't trying to vote for Buchanan. But we also know that networks called Florida for Gore soon after the polls closed in Florida and forgot that the heavily Republican panhandle is an hour behind because it's in a different time zone. And that affected some turnout. There were people in line in the panhandle that said, well, no sense standing here for another hour to vote because my candidate's lost. So What is the other problem with the SAVE Act? The other problem is the 10th Amendment. Voting is very much a state issue. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution does say that Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter regulations as to the manner of voting in national elections. But the time, place, and manner of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature. So Congress is given certain power to create regulations, except as to the places of choosing the senators. However, they don't tend to get into the specific regulation of voting, and every one of our 50 states and District of Columbia has different rules. And one thing I like to remind people of when we're talking about voting and how it is not really a national issue, it's a state issue, is nowhere in the Constitution will you find a right to vote. For some reason, Jimmy Madison didn't think voting was worth putting in the Constitution. The Constitution does, in the amendments, say who you can't discriminate against. Can't discriminate against former slaves and other racial groups. You can't discriminate any longer against women. You can't discriminate against people based on age as long as they have attained age 21. And you can't discriminate against the poor because of the poll tax. But beyond that, it doesn't say who can vote. And, if you could come up with a way that didn't discriminate any of those groups, that said that we only allow people to vote who have green eyes, and that didn't fall down into any group that had a natural violation of any of those other standards, you might be able to get away with it. But, truth is, it is a state matter, and it's strange that, once again, we have had parties flip. For years, Republicans were the party of the 10th Amendment and everything was states' rights. And Democrats were more for a national government. And this one, we're getting back into the Democrats supporting the state government and the Republicans trying to come up with a national law. Hopefully, we will resolve it. Hopefully, people will realize that, we should have a national standard for voter ID. You should need to show a photo ID to vote. You should need to prove citizenship to register to vote. And I worry because one of the ways people register these days is through the motor voter law. You register when you vote. You register to vote when you get your driver's license. And believe it or not, you can get your driver's license even though you are not a citizen. You can get a driver's license even as an illegal alien. I once represented a woman in a divorce where her husband, who had a driver's license when she met him, she found out after he had left and gone back to Mexico that he actually wasn't here illegally. And so I'm always a bit nervous when people rely upon the driver's license as the way to prove or the way to register to vote. And then also within the last week, Kansas decided they would throw a monkey wrench into this whole issue by invalidating all licenses issued to transgender people. Anybody whose license indicated their current sex and not their birth sex were invalidated. And it was done like with a 4-day advance notice. So a lot of people actually lost their driver's license. Connected to this issue is that issue of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a sport this year. Every state is trying to do it. Virginia just got another court approval of their gerrymandering. Here in Maryland, where we have one Republican member of Congress who represents the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is still a member of the Confederacy, I think. We are a bit back in Civil War times here on the Eastern Shore. We have the only Republican member of Congress from Maryland. They decided to try to redistrict and would have eliminated any chance of our representative getting elected. The Democrats in the state Senate refused to take that up. Just as the Democrats in the state Senate in Indiana, or the Republicans in the state Senate in Indiana, refused to take up a bill to try to redraw districts in a blatant gerrymandering scheme. And the thing I want to talk about, it's important to understand there are two issues at play that people sometimes combine the two. One issue you can solve, the other one's not so easy. One issue is gerrymandering. The other issue is concentration. And gerrymandering is man-made. Concentration basically happens because of where people move. So if we look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2 says no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained the age of 25 years and have been a citizen for 7 years, and who, when elected, shall have been an inhabitant of the state in which he, or now she, is chosen. Gerrymandering is, of course, drawing the lines in a district to try to favor one party. And often it results in safe seats for both parties. And we saw that happen back after the 2010 census in Pennsylvania, where my district, which was represented by Charlie Dent, which had about a 25% or 25,000 Democratic majority, was redrawn to make his district a safe Republican district, but it created a district that included Bethlehem, Easton, and part of the areas leading up to the Poconos that became a very strong Democratic district. And what resulted from that? Moderates ended up getting defeated in primaries because the more extreme candidate could then win the general election because of the way the district was drawn. So we should always remember that districts should remain geographically contiguous. I mean, you can't have a district that has a pod on the north end of the state and a pod on the south end of the state and call that one. You can do that pretty easily with computer models. You really can. And you can come up with a result that is totally fair. Unfortunately, what it doesn't do is it doesn't address the issue of concentration. And that is the fact that you will often have one party concentrated in a certain area. And if you think of Pennsylvania, you've got Philadelphia, which is 90% Democrat. You've got Pittsburgh City, which is predominantly Democrat. Some of the other cities are strong Democratic influence, and the rest of the state's about 65-35 Republican. So it leans very much Republican, but not to the extent that Philadelphia leans Democrat. And so what happens is you have an election in Pennsylvania, and if you counted up all the votes, the Democrats actually got more votes for Congress, but the Republicans get more seats in Congress. But if we look at and we blame that on gerrymandering because Pennsylvania has done that to a T when it comes to the Congress, when it comes to the state house. But the state Senate is drawn more in a geographic area without gerrymandering, and the Republicans always maintain a hold on the state Senate because of concentration. Those 95% of the vote that you get in Philadelphia gets you one senator, and the 55% you get in the T of Pennsylvania gets one Republican senator. And that's the one that's hard to address, because even if you eliminate gerrymandering in Pennsylvania, you're still going to have an advantage to the Republicans because the Democrats are going to win big in Philadelphia and other districts, and the Republicans are going to win 60-40, 55-45 in the T of the state and pick up more seats. What is the solution? And this could apply to the Electoral College as well, and could also apply for those people who would like to see third parties have an influence in this country. You could, with no constitutional amendment, go to proportional representation, where you allocate representatives on the basis of statewide vote. There is no requirement in the Constitution. Certain state law might require it. No requirement in the Constitution that you be a resident of the district that you represent. So it would be very possible to say state X has 20 representatives, and we're going to allocate those representatives on the vote. And if it's 50% Democrat, 40% Republican, 10% Green, we're going to allocate them that way. It'd be probably about the only way you'd ever get significant minority party representation in this country. Living in England, I noticed that most members of parliament didn't necessarily live in the districts that they represented. They would actually stand in districts that were safe for their party, especially when they were in leadership. The pros of this, it does very much represent one man and one vote, but on a statewide basis. It'd allow third parties to win more seats in Congress. And it might be a good thing to actually end up where we don't have a majority party. And so to get anything done, there has to be compromise. That's the way most parliamentary systems work. And in most countries, you will end up with a coalition government. It would eliminate gerrymandering because you're counting votes on a statewide basis. It eliminates concentration because all those Philadelphia votes get thrown in with all those votes from Shamokin, and it all becomes one big pool. It would also probably require congressional offices to be more nonpartisan because the congressman who has oversight of that office would not necessarily be elected by the people of that district, or wouldn't be just looking to those people of that district, be looking to everybody, not looking just to his voters. And it actually would probably improve service and make it more of a general service. The cons, you lose local representation. You lose the fact that when you go to your local office, the office knows that you're going to either vote for their boss or vote against their boss. And it may make them give you better service, or it may that current system may politicize things. It's been proposed in some states. Pennsylvania actually proposed this at one time, that we would do the same thing for the Electoral College. The Constitution does not require the winner-take-all method of allocating electors in the Electoral College. So you could have it that you win 55% of the vote, you get 55% of the electors, and maybe then if you win the state, you get the 2 seats to go with the Senate. And so you get a little advantage for winning. What that would do, well, everybody wants to always yell about the Electoral College, but can you think of what it's like to be a Republican in California, knowing that you will never, ever be able to elect an elector for the Electoral College because you're never going to have the Republican win that state again? Instead of it being a 60-40 vote for president and 50-some electors going to the Democrat, you would allocate them proportionally. And it would do the same thing in states like in the red states as well, where now you would actually make it meaningful for other parties to vote. So I think it's something as we look at, and we'll have all those discussions and complaints about gerrymandering. I think one of the things that we should start considering in this country is the idea of proportionate representation and allocating representatives to Congress based upon the statewide vote and allocating electors in the Electoral College that way. We currently only have 2 states where it's not winner take all. Maine and Nebraska actually allocate their electors based upon congressional district, and it seems to work well. That's one way to do it, but if that then still brings up the worry about gerrymandering and how you establish those districts. But if you do it on a statewide basis and allocate them proportionally, it seems to work. And now the one thing it could cause too is, to the extent this then means that you have third parties getting votes in the Electoral College, it means you may have elections go to the House of Representatives, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And I'll end with this, because most people think if the election goes to the House of Representatives, the party that's in power is going to elect the president. But actually, when it goes to the House of Representatives, every state gets 1 vote. And so the representatives in that state determine the vote. And so California gets 1 vote and Wyoming gets 1 vote. And if we end up with an election in the House, that will blow people's minds. Well, we've run a little bit over. It's been great to talk with you and be with you again. As always, if you'd like to drop me a note and give me any feedback or suggestions, it is Kenny B Seeking Truth at Gmail, Kenny B Seeking Truth at Gmail, or you can follow me on Facebook at Seeking Truth. We will see you again next week, everybody. Till then, we will keep the coffee on. And I hope you all have a great week and that you remembered to turn your clocks ahead. Goodbye, everybody.
Pull up a chair, let the cups clink soft. Little laugh in the corner, world talking on and off.